Um, so welcome everyone to our weekly DMICE research conference. And as sometimes happens when we don't have a speaker, we pull in the Clinical Informatics Journal Club that normally takes place on Thursdays among the Clinical Informatics Fellows. Although actually this topic is actually one that would hopefully be of some interest, across the BCB HCIN divide of the department. I had actually read this article before. I was told that Eric wanted to present it, and I actually thought it was interesting because I also, as many of you know, have an interest in access and retrieval of information, of clinical information. Um, so uh, most of you, probably all of you know Eric, but just briefly, he is one of our clinical informatics fellows, which means that he's a physician. He went to medical school at San Juan Bautista School of Medicine, and then did a residency in family medicine at Shasta Community Health Center down the road in Redding, California. He then joined our program as a clinical informatics fellow. And so he is going to present to us today an overview and lead some discussion on this article that was published in JMIR recently. So take it away, Eric.
Thanks, Bill. So yeah, he mentioned that, Bill just mentioned that this might be of some interest to some of the biomedical folks, which I certainly hope that will bring some interesting perspectives to the discussion. So this paper is called Infobuttons for Genomic Medicine, Requirements and Barriers. It's a multi-institutional group of authors. So what the point, the objective of this study was really to look at barriers to implementation of free and open source software called FLOSS in health information technology. What is that? Well, most of you probably know, but FLOSS is free and open source software. So free as in freedom, anyone's freely licensed to use it, copy, study, or change it in any way. And open source, that means the source code is publicly available for any use. So generally free and open source are one and the same. It's mainly a philosophical difference. So that's why we kind of use the term FOSS to encompass all of that. Does not mean that it has no cost. You have a license, so you can do whatever you want with the software, but there is a cost. There's a cost of implementation. There's a cost of support. So there is money involved with implementing free software. And then you might also see this term FLOSS. That means free, libre, and open source software. So that word is borrowed from Latin because the English word free can mean either free as in freedom or free as in I don't have to pay for this. So that word is used to make the distinction. So you might see this term that some people prefer. So here are some barriers to adoption identified by a study in 2018, and they're generally categorized into 4 main groups. There's individual barriers, environmental barriers, technological barriers, and organizational barriers. So in health and biomedical informatics, both technical and non-technical considerations are important. And there's all kinds of different infrastructure layers and settings, so there may be different barriers in these different places. And then another thing pointed out by the authors was that the medical specialties may not always have an impact, but they should be considered. And there aren't any identified impacts of medical specialties at this point, but it's just kind of a cautionary point. So this this project was using Infobuttons as a vehicle to study the implementation of this software. So what Infobuttons are like a form of passive clinical decision support. So you have essentially a link inside your EHR where you can get information that you want easily. So this helps. Would you mind muting it? I'm getting some feedback. Is that M? Thanks. Okay. So this makes it easier for providers to access the information they need at the point of care. I got some info on this from the OHSU hosted Clinical Informatics Info Wiki. So the methods for this study was there's a 20-question web-based survey. This was developed by the Infobutton work group of the eMERGE consortium, and they actually developed and hosted one of the products we'll look at. And this survey was made to assess 3 Infobutton related technologies for genetic and genomic medicine. So the first one is the ClinGen EHR Toolkit. It's built upon the open Infobutton system. You can look up genes in here and such. There's DocuBuild, which is a web app, and you can basically create and share stuff inside EHRs, and that's customizable in that way. And there's excuse me, myresults.org, and this is a tool designed for patients to be able to interpret their results, whether it's lab tests or genes or whatever that may be. So the survey was designed with there were open-ended. There's an option for respondents to have open-ended responses. So they collected information about their background, their familiarity with Infobuttons, opinions on the utility of these 3 systems, and then the meat of it is the perceived barriers to adoption at their institution. And they were presented a list of barriers based on the consolidated framework for implementation research. So this is a more generalized barriers to adoption paradigm that were presented. The questions were not, it wasn't a multiple choice question per se, but the respondents were asked to consider these barriers. So the authors selected a sample based on convenience, and then they got recommendations from the people they invited to expand their sampling size. So they limited it to participants in a consortium-driven initiative focusing on implementing genomic medicine. And then within those consortiums, they targeted any groups that focused on informatics, EHR integration, or the return of clinical genomics results, if possible, as those folks were believed to have relevant insight on this question in particular. So here are the consortia that received invitations, and then any specific working groups in there. So they sent out the invitations in February 2017. That's when they started doing that.
Eric, we lost your sound.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes. Yeah.
All right. So anyway, you can read this for yourself. Closed all responses in September 2017. So there were open-ended responses about the perceived barriers, and the authors used qualitative methods to identify the relevant themes. Two of the authors used some open coding, and they went through and tagged these responses as either the sort of predefined CFIR barriers, or they made a new code to identify a new barrier if they thought that was appropriate. There was a significant amount of time that had gone by since this survey closed. And so there's a question, did these barriers change in any way since then? Is there a way to, could this be more relevant now or less relevant now than it was at the time? So the authors did a critical review, and they just did this via email with no blinding, just to determine what was the change to these barriers. And they largely found that there was not significant change. So they got 81 responses to their survey, and out of those, 30% were considered to be complete, and they included those. So incomplete surveys just weren't done all the way, or they got some responses that contained no answers within the system marked it as complete, but they didn't have anything in there. And from these respondents were from 16, this is not an exclusive, these are not exclusive categories, but there was 16 academic medical centers or affiliated health systems that had representatives who responded, 2 health information technology vendors. 4 respondents were at institutions that were affiliated with the development of the systems that were surveyed specifically. And 13 respondents self-declared their involvement in an informatics or HIT work group. So here are the institution names and number of respondents from each institution. A couple of places had 2 respondents, but most had only 1. So 66.7% of the respondents said they were knowledgeable about Infobuttons in general, but less so about the specific tools. Most of them were not using these tools at all at the time of the survey. And the highest usage of these tools was at the institutions in which they were developed, which is unsurprising. And as you can see, 8 respondents said that there were Infobuttons available at their institution. That's 1/3. And then 3 of them use it for genomic medicine. So what were the perceived barriers? Out of the list from CFIR, there was one that was not rated by anyone as a potential issue, and that was poor design, quality, and packaging. Didn't come into play. So these are the CFIR barriers that were identified. These are the so we have lack of adaptability, lack of trialability, not clearly better than alternatives, too complex, lack of evidence, strength, and quality, lack of a legitimate source, or too costly. Those were the ones that were identified. And then through the qualitative analysis, the authors identified 6 additional barriers that they thought deserved consideration. And they said that 3 of them had only 1 supporting quote, but they did see them as broadly applicable. So they warranted their own tag. So the additional perceived barriers are not an institutional priority, lack of demand, lack of EHR integration, lack of coded data, limited institutional resources, and provider workflow issues. So the most commonly cited ones we will discuss in a little more depth in a minute. So the critical review that the authors performed noted that there have been technical and content improvements to all three of these systems since the survey. In particular, the adaptability, trialability, and complexity of these systems is largely unchanged since then. There are new alternatives, so there are other competing systems that are available now that weren't at the time. And institutional priorities are different and they continue to change. So that's another thing that may have changed, is that some folks may have gotten more support from leadership at their institutions to do projects with genetic and genomic medicine, and other people are still facing the same challenges they were before, and that's going to continue to evolve. So there were 14 perceived barriers in total, and notably, none of these are unique to genomic medicine. One in particular that's a particular challenge is this lack of coded data, because results are often in PDF documents, PDF form, which can't effectively be parsed by the systems. So that's faced often in genomics. But because these are not unique barriers, there are some existing models that can be leveraged to aid in adoption. There, of course, there are specific considerations within healthcare, and then also even more specifically to genetic and genomic medicine. So these barriers are, we'll talk about each of the barriers more or less in order of the amount of times they were cited. And we won't mention every single one, but the discussion also will sort of combine some of the barriers into one discussion point when the recommendations on how to address them are more or less along the same lines. So first of all, there's a lack of adaptability, and there's quite a difference in the culture around the delivery of care and engagement with patients, engagement with clinicians at different healthcare institutions, which is one of the reasons the authors think this might be so important to the respondents. And then also the implementation of genetics and genomic medicine varies at all these institutions as well. So there is some adaptability. The ClinGen Toolkit and DocuBuild allow you to basically choose which information resources you're going to pull your results from. However, something that hasn't really been taken into account by any of these projects is like the way that the results are formatted and displayed. So basically, institutional branding, they can't really do that. And that might be important to some of these places, and it's not an option with this stuff. So there was not really a recommendation provided by the authors to address this barrier, but it seems like allowing customizable branding by institutions might lower this barrier. And then we have a couple of them here together: not an institutional priority and lack of demand. So, obviously healthcare institutions have lots of competing priorities and they can't take them on all at the same time. So one thing suggested is, use careful planning and choose a leader or a champion for genetics and genomic medicine. That seems pretty clear. And And then, you know, the same thing that we hear with every project at every institution, you have to clearly describe the benefits and to the practicing clinician. So you have to get, you know, buy-in from your stakeholders. It's a pretty standard approach. So you can get leadership, but if you don't have the people in the trenches supporting the project, it's not going to work. And this applies to every IT project or pretty much any institutional project. So there was a lack of trialability. So these products do have publicly available trials, so you can go and try them out. However, different institutions require customizations in their implementation of this, and there's not a ability to try that out, and they also can't use it in their actual clinical workflow. So that sort of trial is limited in its utility. So a way to address this barrier is to for the developers of the software, they need to identify their partners, and then they actually need to support them in their implementation of the software, and they need to make sure they have the resources to do that. So that's obviously a big ask, but you know, without the ability to really see how these products work in practice, a lot of institutions are going to be hesitant to, you know, put the resources towards implementing them. So not clearly better than alternatives. So some of these tools, if they are truly novel, it's difficult for the potential adopters to identify the benefits of them in the brief time that they have to actually evaluate them. So the proposed solution to this is essentially to do market research and develop marketing material, and to reference the other competing existing systems that do similar things. This kind of goes back to almost to the institutional support lack of demand. I mean, it's all about communication. You know, what can this stuff do for you? You have to clearly explain it, and you have to get, you know, not just the technical people on board with it. So there's a complaint that it's too complex, and so the initial thought is the user interface, but that's not really the consideration that is at the top here. It's the implementation that is considered to be complex, and that's the case in just about every one of these you know, organizational IT projects. The implementation is always complex, but the way to address it is with the quality of the documentation. So, you know, the developers need documentation that has been you know, tried out, and they've verified, they've used their own documentation. And so if we go back to the previous barrier about supporting partners in implementation, they need to have instructions that they can follow along with to make sure they work. But then, you know, outside of the control of any FLOSS developers would be the IT culture and the internal governance and approval process at the institution. That obviously plays a huge role in the perception of how much resources these projects will take up. And then there's a concern about the lack of evidence strength and quality, and also lack of a legitimate source. So in clinical settings in healthcare, they demand quality and robustness in the tools they're using, because, you know, we're talking about people's lives and significant liability as well. So oftentimes popularity is equated with quality. So you look around and say, how many other institutions are using this product? And if no one else is using it, you're not going to be the first one. So one way to address this is the legitimacy of the evidence of the information from these resources has to be clearly presented. And this is in addition to the technical quality of the actual tool. And this is continuing to evolve in genetics and genomic medicine. And like the ClinGen tool, for example, now at this point has clearly presented sources and links there, and they can show how to attribute it. So this is improving. And another complaint is the lack of EHR integration. This is another very tough problem because EHR systems are not free and open source. So they're usually like a black box. Developers simply cannot. They don't have access to EHRs. Essentially, if you are not an employee of the institution utilizing the EHR, if you're not a clinician, you just won't get to see what you're working with. And so the integration points of where these info buttons can be placed or how the product actually interfaces with the EHR when it faces the user is inconsistent. There's different rules with different EHRs, and there's not a set of published standards or even anything that the developers can look at. So one way in potentially is Smart on Fire, which is a standard that allows communication of healthcare data between different systems, and it's standardized, and it does depend on it being implemented in the EHR, but as a information blocking, there's the Cures Act, 21st Century Cures Act, which passed, mandates sharing of information between healthcare information systems. So that eventually it seems like this will be a way for free and open source software to get essentially hook into the existing clinical information systems. So yeah, there's large challenges to implementing any sort of new software package, and this everything's ready to come tumbling down at any point. So people can be very conservative about using new software in large institutions. So thanks for your time. I hope that we have some discussion that might provide some insight about this topic. If anyone has any particular experience with any of these tools, I'd love to hear about it. Any questions for me or clarifications about anything we talked about are also welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Nice presentation. Actually, you gave a very good talk. You presented the paper well. I might have at the beginning thrown in a slide just so people can kind of understand a little bit about info buttons, which are really meant to kind of marry clinical data to information resources. Many of us, or some of us anyways, know Jim Semino, who kind of developed this notion back in the 1990s. And info buttons work great when you have structured data on each side. So you may have like an ICD-9 or 10 code or SNOMED code in the EHR, and that can get translated to like a mesh term, to access the literature. And that's kind of the focus of what info buttons try to do. So it's a lot more challenging, as I think, with these genomics resources that may not be as well structured, or may not be as well structured in the kinds of terminology systems that are used in clinical systems. And then one other large question, I don't want to take up all the time. It really is a form of search, and I think a big unanswered question is Is it better to try to anticipate the user search by putting this button and linking them to something, or just giving them a search box and letting them have at it? I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, and then we can open it up to the rest of the group.
So excellent point. So I like having, personally, my personal thoughts are that having the buttons is excellent when they are when they're relevant, and because if I want to know something, there's usually a search box I can find, but the suggestion that here's more information is often appreciated. I mean, sometimes I'm not going to go all the way to a search box, but if I see the button there, I'm going to think of a question that I want answered. So I think there's definitely value in that approach.
And I guess I'll just add one other thing. You also raised the question of evidence, and again, it's an issue of what is relevant. Well, not relevant isn't a good word. What's applicable in the clinical setting. Some animal study or tissue culture study might be great as a potential for some genomic therapy. But obviously, if a clinician is going to use it, it will need to have been tested in some sort of clinical trial kind of setting.
Right. So yeah, I have essentially no experience with genetic or genomic medicine in my clinical practice, but I do want evidence cited when I am taking recommendations from a computer. So one thing, for example, is I do a lot of healthcare maintenance as a family doctor. So there's recommendations from the EHR. This person needs this vaccine or this screening study or whatever it may be. And oftentimes these things are really straightforward, and it's just like if you're over this age, you're over 65, you get a pneumonia shot, for example. But then a lot of the recommendations are more nuanced than that. So if you are, say, a cigarette smoker, then you should be vaccinated with the pneumonia shot at any age. You don't have to wait until 65. So, oftentimes an EHR will recommend a pneumonia shot for somebody, but it's just a list of recommendations for this patient, pneumonia shot. And as a physician, I want to know, why, right? I can go through a big list of questions with any particular patient. Maybe this is a new person, I've never met them before, to try to figure out why the system is flagging them as needing a pneumonia shot. But I mean, that's the perfect place for an info button to say, this patient is recommended for this because of this reason, and this is, why this is important. And I mean, that would immediately allow me to feel comfortable, ordering that for them without taking more than probably 10 seconds. See, I saw something in the chat there. Right, so Vishnu's point is that the amount of genomic information available currently is hugely greater than the amount of actionable genomic information. And that's a really good point, because yeah, when if I'm busy seeing a bunch of patients, if there's an info button, I might get the chance to learn something. I'm definitely not going to go out and do a complicated literature search in the middle of a clinic day, but But I would click on a button, and then so not sure if the gap between theory and action is reduced that much. Yeah, I guess that's an open question.
So this is Vishnu. So one, apart from the actual incorporation of genomic information, I think, one thing that this paper really got me thinking about was how do you kind of incorporate open source software into a commercial EHR environment that exists in most institutions, right? And I think two kind of take-home messages, as you said, Eric, just because it's so-called free and open source is neither necessarily free nor open source in its entirety, right? And even even some of the obvious open source software that's used in healthcare are often associated with very significant implementation and maintenance costs. And so there is no free lunch, in many cases in the healthcare application of these software. The real tricky, kind of challenging part is if you think of an organization like OHSU that has been part of a commercial EHR vendor ecosystem for well more than a decade, how do you incorporate any kind of advancement in open source technology and resources and integrate it in a relatively seamless fashion into, say, an Epic shop or a Cerner shop or a Meditech shop? That's pretty challenging without having to resort to, coming out of the electronic health record or so I would be really actually kind of curious as to, what folks who are more knowledgeable about this than I am think about incorporating Infobuttons into commercial EHRs that integrate into open source software.
So Rohit has an interesting point. Thinking about genomes in a clinical context isn't taught yet in medical schools. When presenting patients, there's no section for genes after your micro portion of your HPI. So from a generational standpoint, as genomic information becomes clinically useful, demand for Infobuttons will reach a more critical mass when future doctors are accustomed to genetic info. And that is a good point. And I believe that that was more or less cited. Let me see here. I'll go ahead and pull the slides up again. If we go to the responses, here we go. So yeah, the mission critical use case, basically, as this stuff is useful and as it's expected to be needed, there's going to be a clear use case which will probably address lack of demand for this stuff, and that's going to take time.
So I'm trying to figure out which side of the generational divide I'm on. It was meant to be a joke. But I mean, there's really layers of issues here. I mean, to a little bit reiterating what I had said before, there are some kind of practical implementation issues. Many of you spend more time tooling around inside of Epic than I do, but I know that the info button is an HL7 standard, and I believe it's implemented in Epic. But then you get into the question of how much do you want to let informatics people tool around inside of Epic. But I think the larger question actually gets to Rohit's point, which is that there is becoming more and more actionable genomic information in clinical care. But the question is, what's actionable? What's the best way to get people to that information? What is the level of evidence? Is it something that is a sort of inferential kind of pathway that you took with 3 levels of redirection to get to, or something that was started in a clinical trial. I mean, I actually have to say, especially for those of you who are looking for thesis and dissertation projects, this whole notion of how we implement this complex genomics in a clinical setting is a real ripe area. And because we are learning more and there is more actionable information, but it's also, how do we boil that down to clinical decisions that get made? And probably the most area where it's most advanced is in cancer with molecular targeted therapies and so forth. But even those, and I mean, there are some people who are building clinical decision support systems for those sorts of things. But again, the question is, can you boil the facts down to some algorithmic pathway to take, or do you really need a clinical expert on the patient and a kind of a subspecialist who knows that area to really make that kind of decision, as opposed to a clinician clicking on a button. It's a little different than a drug interaction warning, which is pretty stereotypical. These are probably a lot more complex decisions that would need to be made.
So I have a question for you, Eric, and also possibly for Bill. I mean, one of the the main reason that they kind of point as a barrier is the lack of institutional priority and the lack of demand, mostly the lack of institutional priority. And then when they actually, in the discussion section, when they talk about it, it's a little bit sketchy, right? I mean, they say we need to have a physician champion, and then we need to figure something else out. It's the essence of that discussion section. So I would be really curious as, what are these, how do we actually make, this kind of, I mean, clearly we understand the value of it as informaticians. How do we make this kind of effort and institutional priority within our clinical organizations? Are there other things that, we can do apart from just, identifying physician champions and reaching out to leadership?
Well, I mean, with any of these things, it's the very specific use case, like the word picture, is there a real example of an improved outcome for a specific person based on genomic information, and that was accessed by a typical or a primary care doctor, or somebody not an ultra specialist? And and then do you have an example of a patient that couldn't, or this would have applied to, but they didn't receive an intervention because their clinician didn't know this information? And I mean, that's the kind of, like, it paints a picture, and it tells a story about a person's life, and that, without that kind of example, I'm not sure how you get there from here.
There are definite examples, and actually I'm not the expert, so if there's anyone who correct me if I'm wrong about things, but for example, there's certain types of lung cancer, I think small cell carcinoma, where patients who have a specific gene variant in their tumor respond well to a chemotherapy agent that other people don't respond to at all. Some of the it's the whole precision medicine paradigm of really, identifying the molecular pathways and drugs that are effective against them. Again, to me, the question is whether you could boil those situations down to something for which an info button, would be helpful. I think, the original vision of info buttons was that, you would have a patient with diabetes, and you would be looking at a potential drug to prescribe, and you click on it to pull up information about that drug related to diabetes. But those are really broad topics, as opposed to something like a very narrow, targeted therapy. So, that's the situation, that getting that information, of course, again, how many times is the, primary care doc going to be making a treatment decision on chemotherapy on a cancer patient? Uncommon. So, I guess another question, I would have, about this study is, I mean, genomic medicine really a good use case for Infobuttons? It may be. I don't want to dismiss it out of hand, but if you think of some of the kind of decisions that get made in treating patients with conditions that are amenable to knowing their genome variant, who's going to use that kind of information?
Right. And right now it's the specialists, right? And oncologists, do they need an info button to explain the paradigm of selecting their treatment? No, they generally don't, and they're going to be reading more detailed information than probably is going to just come up in an info button. They're already aware of the issue. Rohit mentioned something about SSRI medications, and that's a great idea. I mean, I would love it if I had some guidance on what kind of SSRI to choose, because I prescribe a significant amount of those, and generally it's like, well, what does the patient feel like they want to do? Or you just kind of roll the dice with basically the consensus is that this SSRI is more activating, and this one, but there's not a bunch of evidence on that. But yeah, I think, and as Vishnu mentioned, I think we just don't have we don't have information about our patients' genetics generally. I mean, like, allopurinol, for example, is going to cause like Stevens-Johnson syndrome in a certain number of people, and you might want to prescribe that for gout, but you're not going to test them first. If you're particularly astute, you might mention to the patient, hey, if you get your skin starts to fall off after you take this medicine, please stop. But when are we going to have that kind of information about people? If we're talking about a cancer treatment, yeah, people are going to be happy to have their genetics tested or whatever the case may be to help them survive. But if it's just gout or whatever, then we're not going to have it beforehand, and we're not going to wait to get it before we treat them.
I mean, Eric, in an ideal environment, at some point in the future, I assume that genomic information will be incorporated enough to have a drug genomic interaction checker for every time you prescribe something, right? So I would love that reality where it's not that I have to actively try and order a test in order to find the genomic stuff. So, everyone's kind of sequenced into the EHR, and it's automatically being kind of added to that list. And it's also depending on, for example, if I take care of generations of families, if all their genomic information can be integrated because the parent had a higher risk of had an autosomal dominant disease, I can start thinking about, it just becomes interesting. I want to get back to the point though. After I read this paper, one of the things that I thought of was, how do I make an ROI argument for this, right? I mean, how do I kind of sell this from an ROI perspective to an institution? And I didn't get there, right? I mean, I couldn't. And the depressing thought that I had was, once there is a patient harm that occurs because of a delayed diagnosis or a delayed, response to identifying genomic information that was already in the chart, that's when, organizations may probably sit up and take notice that there's a need to actually do this, because otherwise we're going to get sued. But there really isn't a good ROI response. And I see M's comment on chat that the FLOSS aspect of the discussion is at best secondary to the goals that I'm hearing as priorities. And it's really so funny that we spent all this time talking about stuff, but the real kind of focus of the paper was on the FLOSS aspect, right? And it's pretty remarkable that we're kind of deviated from that primary topic.
Yeah, they specifically mention that in their objectives, but and I'm not entirely familiar, but I don't know how many other, how many commercial alternatives are there to, info buttons for genetics and genomics research? Is that really significant? I mean, the whole product itself, is like a new thing. Like, yes, they're free and open source, these in general, but that's not the barrier, right? And when they talked about the barriers to implementation, they weren't specific. I mean, first of all, they weren't specific to genetics and genomics. They weren't specific to free and open source. I mean, it came up again and again. Somebody has to clearly elucidate the use case and communicate why it's useful in, basically like, CEO terms to people to get this stuff to be adopted. And that really does have nothing to do with open source, or, that's like a basic tenet of institutional change.
Yeah, but remember too, though, that info buttons, is really just a standard way of basically taking some clinical data out of the EHR and sending it to basically a search engine, or to a knowledge resource that's structured enough where you would know to point, and then basically sending that back. And again, some of you who are here spend more time inside. I don't know. My understanding is that Epic implements info buttons. It is an HL7 standard. I don't know how well, but it's one thing to have this API basically that lets you exchange information back and forth, but then it's another thing to be able to figure out, what is the right data to put there, where on the screen do you put it, what the workflow, and then on the other side, on the knowledge resource, do you have access to it? Some things like PubMed are free. Other things, like UpToDate, well, I guess OHSU has a license to it, but those sorts of things cost money. And then these genomics resources, some of them are fairly well structured, but they may not be structured in a way that is that aligns well with SNOMED or ICD-10 codes, things like that. Let me actually ask the audience: does Epic support info buttons? I mean, if OHSU, if ITG gave you the blessing, could you connect, say a lab ordering screen to some lab resource?
Yeah, they call it active guidelines. That's the Epic language for it.
Okay.
And commercial third parties have already done exactly what you said, Bill, like, connect the lab. So for example, ClinGen is Elsevier's product. They do exactly that.
Mm-hmm.
What product is that, Vishnu?
Elsevier's ClinGen, CLINIKEY, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, clinical key, is that it?
Yeah.
It's ClinGen.
Yeah, okay.
Epic loves to change the names of just like they call clinical decision support best practice alerts, just to confuse people. Any other comments, questions out there? Yeah, this this is a great paper because it really brings out a lot of issues in informatics, and not just like implementation issues, but issues around the EHR and who can do what with it, and accessing more free and open resources and so forth. So, well,
Yeah.
okay. I'm sorry, did someone say something?
Oh, I just said, yeah, I agree. It makes for an interesting discussion because it goes from clinical practice all the way up to like, how do you sell an institution on implementing a huge project, and what's the mechanics of that? So
yeah. Good. Okay. Well, thanks everyone for attending today. I agree. It was great discussion. And I guess as long as I have people's attention before they leave, so we have we have a bunch of talks coming up, some not at the regular times because of thesis and dissertation defenses and things like that. We do have an outside speaker next week, Dr. Kendra Cato from Columbia University. And then also, everyone is welcome to virtual commencement, whether you're graduating or not. The invitation just went out, and it'll be great to see people at commencement. Not as much fun as being there in person and your regalia and all that, but it will still be fun nonetheless. Okay, take care, everyone. Good to see you all.